Today, I'll be talking about my Backwoods Composites Super Curve setup, the MOAC 2.0 limbs, and the Hit 19 riser, although this video is really going to focus on the limbs and the overall performance of the setup, and specifically how I have this set up for hunting in case I get any questions from you guys. I can just refer you to this video. Now, this bow, and especially these limbs, are defined as super curves, so they have more of a recurve than a typical recurve would. And what that usually gives you is more energy, because in your draw force curve, it's going to have a little bit more weight on the front end, and then it's going to maintain that weight throughout most of the draw cycle. So whereas most bows would be gaining, a couple pounds per inch of draw all the way back, and then maybe they start to stack up a little bit toward the end, with a super curve, it's a much more aggressive ramp initially, and then it kind of smooths out. And so it has a very smooth feeling even throughout the back end of the draw, to the point where depending on the specific super curve design, there's been some that actually lower their weight a little bit. The MOACs aren't quite like that, but they do drop down to a very low gain per inch. And then the design is such that as you approach and get into your final draw length, it starts to swoop up just a little bit to give you more of a solid feeling that, hey, you're at full draw. So how much more energy? Well, if I compare this bow and these limbs, which are 42 pounds at 28 inches compared to my Acadian Woods Arty longbow I did a video on last year, that one's 43 at 28. At my draw length, it's probably closer to 45, 46, and this one's probably around 43, 43 and a half, maybe 44, somewhere in there. I haven't really measured it. But even though I have less weight at full draw, this bow will shoot an arrow that's approximately 200 grains heavier at the same speed. So like 770 grains going 150 versus that longbow shooting like a 560, 570 at about 150. Or I can shoot this one faster. If I have the same arrow weight, then I can get it up to probably like 175 based on what I've tested in Chrono. I can have the actual numbers sitting here in an overlay, but it's substantial. So this would be one of the reasons why somebody might choose to have super curve style limbs. Sizing is probably different than what you're used to. You would choose the limbs based off of your draw length and your riser length. Whereas most normal conventional limbs, you would choose short, medium, long, maybe extra long. The super curve is a longer limb to get that extra curve, but you would want to choose it based off of the table. And then the string size is also not going to be standard, meaning if I chose, like these are the M2 limbs, I would have to look at the table to find out what the actual string length needs to be and give that to the string maker. You can't just say, oh, this is a 66-inch bow, therefore I need, 66 minus 3 or 4 inch string. And so for instance, this string is a Flemish twist string from Triple T, and when I ordered it, I said, hey, here's the limbs, here's the table, here's the riser I'm using it with. And he was like, oh yeah, I've done that before, I know exactly what to make. So that made it pretty easy from my standpoint. So in order to make sure that your brace height is in the right range to make these limbs nice and happy, Sam from Backwoods actually puts a little dark band on the limb, and that is the tolerance window for where you want the string to lose contact with the limb. If your string comes off the limb up here, or if your string comes off the limb here, then it means you need to add or remove twist to the string to make sure that you can get that back to within that tolerance window. Now, are there downsides? Well, from a manufacturing standpoint, you can't make this out of the same materials, the same methods that you can many other bows, so there's not as many people making super curve style limbs. They usually have longer wait times, they can be a lot more expensive, and the price is basically what the price is going to be because there's only so many people making them. These limbs in particular are close to $1,000, which already is more expensive than maybe a lot of people are going to want to pay. That's like the same price as you would pay for nice high-end competition style limbs and a bare bow or Olympic recurve style setup. And also related to that supply chain, you're usually going to have longer wait times unless there's like a blemish set of limbs that comes up or you see them available used. But typically if you're placing a custom order, you're going to have to wait several months, regardless of supplier, and Backwoods Composites in this case is no different. Another potential downside is that the window of tune is a little bit tighter with these, especially when it comes to tiller. If you look at Sam's bow guide, which is super helpful, and I'd recommend reading it even if you don't plan on getting one of his setups, because there's a lot of good information in there. You'll see that the super curve style of limbs are more tiller sensitive than either a conventional recurve style limb or his tack limb, which is somewhere in the middle. It does feel smoother, it stores more energy, and because of that narrower window of tune and the greater sensitivity to tiller, it's not a style of bow that would really be set up well for, say, string walking. But for a fixed crawl that you can tune to, or if you're going to shoot 3-under or split finger and shoot it basically the same way every time, no problem. But realize also that if you're somebody that has a lot of variation in how they're pressuring their fingers or how you're pressuring your grip, then you might not be able to shoot it as accurately as you could a more conventional style of bow. That's just something that you're giving up to be able to get the performance. And I started with the limbs backed out 3.5 turns. Ultimately, you're just trying to get these limbs timed correctly. It's especially important with these super curved style of limbs. When you draw back and shoot, you want the top limb and the bottom limb closing at the exact same time and pushing that arrow directly. Because it has that very steep forced draw curve, if you get unbalanced, then it can create some issues. I actually found that with my setup, I ended up with an ever so slightly positive tiller. And usually, if somebody has any type of crawl, the standard recommendation is to try and go more negative, which can be helpful when it comes to finger pressure, but when it comes to the limbs being timed correctly, that might not always be the case. You might end up with an even tiller, you might end up with a slight positive. You basically just have to go and check. I like using a slow motion camera, but there are other ways that you can check your tiller timing as well. The precision tuning course from the Push Archery goes into great detail on tuning. And Sam also has an infographic that I'll share on proper limb timing as well, and some of the engineering things that can lead into why somebody might want a positive or a negative tiller. But what was interesting from Sam's infographic was that there's very few scenarios in which a negative tiller would give you good limb timing. Maybe I made that sound a little more complex than it needed to be. You set this bow up just like you would most other recurves, but it is going to be more sensitive to tiller and proper limb timing than most other recurves. That's basically the high level summary. For my hunting setup specifically, I am a little bit on the heavier side. These arrows are in the upper 600 grain range. They're only going upper 150s, maybe close to 160 feet per second. And I'm shooting with a fixed crawl. It's about a 3/4 inch crawl. This gets me a 25-yard point on. With the hunting setups for me, it's always been a compromise. Anchoring up as high as I can get underneath my cheekbone and a nice tight anchor, I still have a pretty long point on distance with faster arrows. So when I shot this with a mid 500s going, 170 with a 3-under, I had like a 40-yard point on, which, for a Western guy, that might be perfect. 40-yard point on, and then when you're, 20, 30 yards, you can just kind of aim instinctively and then use your gaps as you get closer to that point on. But for whitetail, I just always found that for me, I'm not as precise when I have a big gap. If I have a 25, 28, 30 inch gap at a hunting distance, the point of the arrow is down in the dirt, or at the deer's hooves, and it's just hard to aim with. That's part of the reason too why I had a 30-yard point on with my longbow setup last year. And with this exact rig, I had experimented with extra long arrows. I actually spliced some arrows to make them a little bit longer, and I was shooting fast, like 180s with a better point on. And I just didn't like the way that thing set up. It was a little finicky for me. So I went kind of back to basics a little bit. The heavier, slower arrow, which helps a lot with the point on, and then combining that with that fixed crawl. It's a specialist whitetail type setup. I wouldn't set it up like this if I were going out west. I wouldn't set it up like this if I was shooting 3D. Basically, it's a compromise. But it's a compromise that allows me to have my best precision at those closer distances, 25 yards and in. I still think, and I'm very interested in continuing to develop the thumb draw style, because that allows you to get that arrow way up closer to your eye, not have to worry about smashing your nose from a high outside of your face anchor, and allowing me to then shoot a little bit faster arrow and still maintain a good point on distance. And I also think that these limbs would still serve well in that kind of a context. In fact, you're going to get a little bit more speed out of them because of the longer power stroke and the little bit cleaner release that you can get with the thumb. When it comes to bow noise, maybe you guys can get a feel for this on the video. I'd say the way I have this set up right now, it's not quite as quiet as my longbow, but it's every bit as quiet as recurve setups that I've done in the past with a similar type of fixed crawl, and perhaps even a touch quieter. I have 4 sets of silencers on the string. If you have your bow set up, and here's the biggest thing, if the limbs are timed perfectly and your tune is good, that cuts out a ton of noise, to where if you just add a little bit of silencing material, it's like, wow, how did you get that thing so quiet? If you have your limbs off timed a little bit, then they're vibrating longer and they're vibrating a little bit out of sync, and that, especially with an arrow that might not be tuned perfectly or a lighter weight arrow, can make the overall setup sound a lot louder. I had always heard that super curves were noisy, and when I initially tried to set it up, it was, until I got things dialed in, and then it became a lot quieter. When I was shooting this thing at a certain point last year, experimenting with a close to 800 grain arrow, 3 under with perfect limb timing, it was very close to the sound level that I had with that RD longbow. And granted, I was shooting 16 grains per pound roughly, but I was still getting the same speed as that longbow shooting, a much lighter arrow. And so I started out with that same setup here, shooting it off the shelf. But when I tried to want to go from 30 yards to 25, and I had to start to do that little bit of a crawl, when you crawl down that string and you let go of the string, immediately what happens is that string reconforms around the nock, and you'll actually get some vertical flex in the arrow. And from a tuning perspective, that might make it a lot harder for you to get those limbs timed appropriately. And I found that when you got that extra flex in the arrow, I've just never been able to get a large crawl setup as quiet as I could with like a 3 under or a split finger. For me, it's just that trade-off that if I go with 3 under split finger, I can't shoot as precisely as I could if I get that arrow with a much closer point on distance. So with that fixed crawl, I tried initially doing it off the shelf because I like the simplicity. But what I found is that with that vertical flex, I would a lot of times get bounce off the shelf, and I a lot of times had a very knock low reaction. To fix that knock low reaction, I'd have to did some strange things with the limb timing, and had a really high knock point, which I wasn't a huge fan of. With the springy rest, when you get that downward pressure, instead of it just bouncing up, it kind of absorbs that a little bit. And so I didn't have to deal with as many tuning issues. It was easier for me to get this to tune. And so I still try to keep that springy rest low, close to the shelf, to help minimize any errors between the distance of the rest compared to the pivot point of my grip. But this just seemed to overall work better with that current setup. I put moleskin on the bar. With a lot of arrows, I found that using a PTFE shrink tube or like using the D-loop material worked just fine, or using dental floss and wrapping it. But with these Day 6 arrows, for whatever reason, it just seemed like I could only get them as perfectly quiet as I wanted when I used the moleskin. I don't have any specific ties when it comes to arrows. I've got Easton arrows at home. These ones happen to be Day 6 and 300 spine. I've got Black Eagle Instinct arrows on some of my bows. What made the difference for me is when I needed to go to that heavier arrow to try and get the point on distance closer, these 300 spine arrows with a lot of weight up front ended up being what tuned the best. Instead of the Day 6 insert setup though, I am using the Ethics because I could get so much weight there. It's that stainless steel heaviest insert that they have in the 65 grain sleeve. So there's a lot of weight in that component system. On the back end, these arrows I'm showing in the video today have 4 TRAD vanes. They're 2 1/4 inch. I had taken 3-inch TRAD vanes and put them in a feather chopper to actually get them down to 2 1/4 inches, and I used 4 of them. That cut a little bit of weight off the total setup. But to be honest, I think at this point I'd be just as happy going with a heavy helical with 3. I'd fletched these last year. I'm just not going to mess with refletching them at this point. I also have some of these arrows with wild turkey feathers in like a 5/8 inch high profile. So they're very forgiving. I would say more forgiving than these, but they're louder. So that's, again, the trade-off there. One's quieter, one's a little bit louder, but more forgiving. And then when it comes to the nocks, I'm currently using those 1/66 diameter halo nocks. I have some mixed feelings on them. It seems like the things I do like, they're really lightweight, they're really easy to use, and they seem to fly pretty well for me. The things I don't like is that the electronics seem to be pretty weak. The battery, I don't know, I just have had mixed results where some stop working after a couple shots. they don't seem to do well in terms of shelf life. Like I'll have some that seemed like they were working fine last year and now they seem like they're barely lit up at all without even having used them. And when they are working as intended, they're not as bright as, say, nocturnals or fire nocks. Fire nocks would be another really awesome option for this size of arrow. They're just kind of a pain to install and deal with, and they're extremely expensive. If it weren't for the hunting aspect, I wouldn't even bother with lighted nocks. I would just use standard nocks, but being able to see where you hit, and if I'm filming and be able to replay exactly where that arrow went, especially in a low light condition, is just such valuable information to have when you're trying to make a decision on, do I track right away, do I give it a little bit of time, all that sort of thing. And I've experimented with little marabou wraps around the back or just big bright feathers in general, and none of them in a low light scenario really even come close to comparing with that big bright red orb of a lighted nock. And then for the broadheads, because I was able to drop back down to the 125 grain heads, it gives me a ton of different choices. I kind of narrowed it down to the Iron Will wide, the S125 or single bevel, either one, and then the VBS broadheads that I had gotten, which are a much larger cut. They're like 1 1/4 by, close to 1 inch. But it seems like from a flight standpoint, the S125 and the single bevel 125 are flying a little bit more forgiving for me, and they're super quiet in flight, so that's probably what I'm gonna shoot with, just because that confidence and being able to hit where I'm aiming is a little bit higher tier of importance for me than either a little bit of extra cut or the sound quality. But they're already quiet, so that's not really a big deal. I have a gun-shy 4-arrow quiver on this bow. I like it a lot. I like how I can set it up exactly how I want it to. The balance for me is pretty good when I balance it in this direction. I did mount it so that the quiver is a little bit forward of the riser. What you tend to find with super curves is that they pair well with risers using a lot of deflex, because otherwise they have extremely low brace heights. So you usually see them paired with a lot of deflex, and even in this case, this Backwoods Composites riser has a lot of deflex, and it's still like a 7 1/8 inch brace height. So when you have more of that mass a little bit further back on the riser, the balance tends to do this a little bit more. And if you add a quiver back there, it does even more of the same. Ultimately, from a hunting standpoint, probably not the end of the world, but having it balanced a little bit more neutrally gives me a little bit of extra confidence. I know Sam, on his personal hunting bow, he actually takes his quiver and mounts it upside down so that he can basically have it balance like a well-weighted bear bow without the additional weight that would be associated with like bear bow weights. He's just using the natural weight that his quiver already has. A couple of extra comments on the limbs. So durability, absolutely cannot speak highly enough of the durability. Sam does dry fire testing on his limbs. He's done videos on them. And I've never actually mentioned this to him or anybody else, but I'll say in this video, I had these limbs for about a week, and I don't know exactly what happened. It was one of two things. Either my nock had come detached and I didn't realize it when I was at full draw, or maybe, it's just after restringing the bow and I didn't quite have the string fully in the groove. Whatever the case, I took that shot. The string detached, the limbs went flying. I think the top limb went across my garage, rattled around, smashed on the concrete floor. And I thought to myself, like, I just destroyed this brand new $1,000 set of limbs. I thought there was no way that they would still be in working condition. I've done less and gotten cracks out of wood core limbs. But when I went and picked those limbs up and did a full-blown inspection on them up and down, I couldn't find any damage. I set them back up, started gingerly shooting them again, and then going right back to full speed, and they're fine. And that was over a year ago at this point, and they're still shooting just fine. So definitely thumbs up on the durability. You'll notice that the finish on the limbs, it's a matte finish, and I haven't gotten the courage quite yet to do any kind of spray painting or any kind of limb covers on them. Compared to a clear fiberglass over a wood core, obviously it doesn't look quite as natural in a woods type of environment. I don't think that this is glossy enough to where it gives me a big noticeable sheen. It's more of that matte sheen though. So maybe at some point I'll throw a couple little streaks of spray paint over the top, but for now it's not really big enough of a deal for me to do anything about it. And also one thing that I have noticed is when I'm going through the woods and bushwhacking with this thing, if I'm dragging it through twigs and brush or whatever, the twigs ticking the limbs is slightly louder, a little bit more of a sharp sound than if I had a fiberglass limbed bow and those twigs were, you know, snapping against the limbs. Again, that's probably more of a thing that bothers me with my ears being 2 feet away than it would make a practical difference, but something to be aware of. I haven't shot a lot of other carbon fiber limbs like this to really be able to give a comparison. If it's a carbon versus a fiberglass or wood type of a thing, or if it has anything specific to do with these limbs in the preload, but figured I'd mention it nonetheless. So in case anybody brings it up or mentions it, I do have this bow kind of set up in such a way that really works well for a vertical bow style. And you might be asking yourself, what about heavily canted? And what I found is that if you're using like a fixed crawl and you do need to heavily cant your bow for whatever reason, like if you got an overhead limb or you're out in a grassy area and you just don't want to have that extra profile sticking up, you can still shoot with this thing pretty low, but you have to adjust your anchor a little bit. So like on that shot, normally my anchor is underneath my cheekbone, and I actually had to lift it up and outside. And how do I know where to put it? Well, you just move it until that arrow lines up underneath your eye again. And when you do that, it just becomes like looking down a shotgun barrel. I mean, that was pretty much an instinctive shot. I still was aware of the arrow, but I was able to kind of sight down it with my peripheral vision. For my particular hunting style, that's a pretty rare thing to have to cant the bow like that, but I could see, you know, if you were out in an open grassy area and you didn't want that extra limb profile up over your head, that might be a way to take the shot. I'm just about always up in a tree or I'm on the ground, and if I'm up in a tree, I'm usually hunting out of a saddle, in which case you can maintain a pretty vertical bow and literally just about any angle. You can reference the video I did last fall to see those different angles and how you take those shots. Although I could see how, you know, when you're in a tree stand, there are certain angles where you have to be able to cant your bow a little bit in order to clear your thigh. And if I'm on the ground, I'm usually not just kind of roving around. I'm usually sitting in one particular spot as if I was up in a tree, but maybe the scenario doesn't really set up well to be in a tree. It sets up with better cover on the ground. I'd usually be on a small stool, or like I even made a little tripod that I modified so that I can actually be kneeling and just have something to rest my butt on. And you can see that even in a spot like this with pretty overhanging limbs, I can still be here at the ready so that when a deer comes in, I can get back to full draw in most scenarios, right? I can set that up to be able to take that vertical bow shot, and it's very little movement, you know, to get from here to here. So for me, I feel like there's very few scenarios in which I would ever need to take a heavily canted shot, but I acknowledge that that possibility does exist, which is why I practice it, just in case. There's one kind of weird quirk that I've seen with the super curve, and that is if you let down and you're torquing the grip and you let down, it's pretty easy to actually get the string to rest outside of the groove. So like if you were doing like a rotational draw and you came back in and you let down by kind of reversing that, you're pulling the string outside of the riser, and the limbs are not going to be able to like give and allow the string to come back into that groove. And so you're going to basically rest that string outside of the groove. So when I go to let down, it's basically, you know, coming right back in along your arm, and that keeps the string riding in the grooves. It's not necessarily a bad thing. It's not like you're gonna derail your string when you're just letting down or anything like that. It's just something I've observed, something to be aware of. For my tab, I'm using a Yost Predator tab. It's still got my marks on there. It's the same tab I used when I shot Field Nationals. But I'm obviously not using those marks for hunting because I'm using a fixed crawl and just going to that same locator every time. One thing I did a little bit different with the tab is I have 3 layers in my tab. I have a kangaroo leather face. It seemed like that wore in really fast, like within a couple shots compared to cordovan. And then I just have 2 of the normal thickness leather backers behind that, so 3 total layers. I also have been using a little bit of my buddy Jared Schaefer's Ginger Ninja tab. That one has a synthetic face instead of the some type of leather, and I've been liking that one quite a bit too. I don't have quite as many reps in it compared to the Yoast tab, so from a familiarity standpoint, I'm probably going to start with this one, and we'll see how it goes from there. I think I covered just about everything with that setup. In case I did forget something, go ahead and drop it in the comments section down below. I'll do my best to answer it. If you're looking for more information about traditional archery, in particular, how you can improve at it, I would definitely recommend, number one, if you have some kind of a coach or mentor type person that's close to you that can give you the advice one-on-one, that's always going to be the best. One-on-one video coaching sessions can also be great, or going to some kind of a boot camp to be able to get that in-person experience. Number two, the courses on the push. I've taken most of them at this point, and they are all, in my opinion, worth the money. And also, interestingly, the AI-based Cyber Scout that Spartan Forge has put together, it's like a language model, kind of like a TRAD GPT, actually has been pretty spot on for a lot of traditional archery type stuff, tuning related questions and that sort of thing. And actually I find the answers tend to be a lot better on average than if you just ask a question out on Facebook and get a whole barrage of different answers all across the board. So definitely check that out as well. And with that, good luck for everybody in this upcoming season.